Cold steel Kukri Machete as modified in previous videos. Caine survival tool, unmodified, straight factory build. Very similar blades after modification, similar overall lengths. Main difference is the handle. Look at the length at the handle on the Caine survival tool versus the cold steel Kukri Machete. And where that comes into play is that the Caine is much more comfortable in a forward grip, because the handle is actually built to take your hand forward, mid, and actually rear. The cold steel Kukri Machete, on the other hand, is much more limited. Now I ground a little space here to use, basically for light carving and very light chopping, but it's nowhere near as comfortable as the Caine survival tool. But even from a few chops, the modified Kukri Machete can hold its own. It's not outclassed. And again, this is with the application of a primary grind, which is of similar height to the Caine survival tool grind, and it has very similar edge thickness and angle. The lengths are very similar. The main difference is the Caine is significantly heavier because the stock is thicker. So you can see the cold steel Kukri Machete has no real issues with penetration. And it's also stiff enough to work in this wood. Relatively easy to pry it apart. This fracture is pretty easy. Let's check and see if you can see a difference between the initial power on the swing. Now it should be kind of obvious that the Caine survival tool is cracking this piece of board off much easier, and that's simply because it has a similar length but greater mass, and I'm swinging it just as fast, so the power to the wood is much higher. However, Simply because the power is greater doesn't mean the chopping ability is going to be greater. The cold steel Kukri Machete has a thinner blade, and thus it requires less work to go through the wood. So even though it impacts with less power, it takes less power to make the same depth of cut. So, it takes about 2 hits to open up a V on the front and then 1 to break it on the back. You need to open up a V on the front because when you hit it on the back, you need the wood to collapse around the notch. If you just make 1 cut on the front and try to break it on the back, the wood has nowhere to collapse, so it won't break. So you can see the Caine survival tool, even though it's bringing more power into the cut, it's not significantly offering greater penetration on this type of wood. And the reason is because the blade simply has a thicker wedge profile, so it takes more energy to move the blade into the wood. And this blade really would benefit from a higher primary grind to get some of this metal out of the way, and you can reduce a fair amount of metal here and still keep the forward blade heft. And if you thin out the tang significantly, you can shift that forward as well, and you'll end up with a lighter blade which will essentially have better chopping ability. However, the thinner blade on a cold steel Kukri Machete isn't always an advantage. You can see here, while the penetration is very high, the blade is sticking relatively heavily, and I'm having to work it up and down to get it out. I'm actually doing more work getting the blade out of the wood than I am putting it into it. Now you can see how easy the Caine came out. Simple leverage and it pops up. Now, move up to some thicker wood. this Caine survival tool comes with a wrist thong. I'm not a big fan of wrist thongs because basically they lash your hand to the handle. So if the knife comes out of your hand, there's a chance that it can actually rotate back towards you. Not something I'm a fan of. But I'm using this with the thong on it just to get a feel for how the handle was supposed to work from Chris's perspective. But eventually I'm going to take that off and modify the handle because it's just way too slick as it is now. Very smooth, and there's not a lot of traction on it, even though it's shaped nice. Now there's a lot of complaints about the texture on the cold steel Kukri Machete handle, saying it's very sharp, and when you first get it, it is very sharp. However, it wears relatively rapidly at first, meaning that the ultra sharp bite sort of goes away. But after that, the amount of wear slows down is negligible, and it just ends up with a relatively secure checkering, if you like checkering. I really like this grip and this texture because it works really well. Even when it's raining, I still got high security on the handle. And I also don't mind a bit of checkering and sharpness on the handle because it keeps me awake, keeps me alert, and keeps me focused on doing what I'm supposed to be doing. If I'm getting a lot of feedback in the hand, if the handle is moving around an awful lot, if this is abrading my hand, I'm not chopping correctly. I'm getting sloppy, I'm not swinging right, I'm not going on my follow through, I'm not following my lines. So once I start to feel that, it snaps me back into shape and I can start focusing on technique again. Now, you don't get that immediate feedback when the handle is nice and smooth like this. And to me, that's a bad thing. I want to know the instant my technique dips below optimal, because that makes me focus back on that. Not only as my technique gets a bit sloppy does my efficiency go down, but the chance of glances and the chance of me cutting myself go up. So I'd like a little bit more abrasion on my hand, which really comes into play if I'm a bit sloppy, and that keeps me focused to be working optimally, following my cut lines, using the right angle, using the right snaps, following through, doing smooth cuts, all of that. I want that feedback in hand. Now you can see the second chop didn't go nearly as nice as the first one. I didn't get my lines as clean enough. Didn't get my angles as clean enough, but I couldn't really feel it in my hand. In contrast, I can feel everything with this. That blade just scalloped right there, and the reason it scalloped is because I didn't have proper follow through on the swing. Brought the knife in, I didn't keep my arm cutting in a straight line, the blade walloped and scalloped out. When it did that, I could feel it in my hand because the blade started to vibrate as it started to come up. As soon as I felt that, immediately I think, okay, gotta slow down, look at what I'm doing, get back on track.